When it comes to conversations about climate change and food production, the livestock industry, specifically beef and dairy, is almost universally viewed as a climate culprit. And with sensationalized headlines such as these, social initiatives, and political pressure, there's a good chance that many of us in this room have felt compelled to reconsider our own consumption of livestock products in order to change our own personal emissions. And while many of us may have the perception that that is resulting in lower intake of livestock products, milk, and meat, the reality is far different. If we evaluate global data here over the last 50 years, we can see a substantial increase in the consumption of meat. However, as outlined by the title of this talk, details do matter. You'll notice that in developed nations, specifically here in North America and Europe, while beef consumption and meat consumption is increasing, it is doing so at a much slower rate than in that of the developing world. And that's important. The narrative and the trend as individuals in these populations move from below the poverty line to a newly formed middle class within these countries, the demand for animal protein consistently increases. And that's going to be important for reasons that we visit later in this presentation. If we shift our view from historical data to the future, the United Nations Food Animal Organization predicts roughly a 10% increase in consumption of meat products within the coming decade. But you can see again, 80% of that growth is centered on developing nations as opposed to that in developed countries such as our own. So again, if we are viewing the goal being decreasing livestock emissions through decreasing consumption, we have overwhelmingly failed. Rather, the question we should be asking ourselves is, can we decrease livestock emissions even as livestock production increases? And in plainer language, more specifically, are all cattle created equally? Before we dive into that, I think it's important for all of us to understand how we measure ourselves when it comes to sustainability and resilience related to livestock emissions. So the primary greenhouse gases of concern in livestock are methane and carbon dioxide. Methane is a byproduct of the animal's unique digestive system. So they're ruminants with 4 stomachs as opposed to monogastrics like ourselves that only have 1 stomach. The bacteria and individual microorganisms that exist within these animals' unique digestive system results in this methane gas being produced. Carbon dioxide, however, is going to be produced through the tilling of soils, which releases carbon stored in the soils into the atmosphere, the utilization of fossil fuels for transportation and energy, as well as animal respiration, which is just breathing like you and I are doing right now. As you might guess, when it comes to greenhouse gases, again, the details matter. Methane is 28 times more potent as a climate warmer than CO2 is. However, it is also uniquely a short-lived climate pollutant. And that means that it's going to only exist within our atmosphere for 10 to 12 years versus carbon dioxide, which estimates range from the hundreds to the thousands of years that carbon dioxide will be in our atmosphere, warming our environment. Additionally, it's important to note that that distinction makes methane from animal agriculture a flow emission as opposed to a stock emission. When we evaluate those differences, we have to understand the biogenic carbon cycle. And this actually predates animal agriculture for millennia as bison and woolly mammoths and various other animals roamed our prehistoric tundras and grasslands. The carbon stored within the plant matter that the animals consumed was digested. Methane was a byproduct of that digestion, and that methane gas is released in the atmosphere. Now, for the 10 to 12 years that it's there as methane prior to undergoing hydroxyl oxidation, that methane gas is warming the environment. After undergoing hydroxyl oxidation, it's broken down into its core components of CO2, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, which is then utilized by plant matter again, and the process continues. And so it's important to note that as methane emissions remain static, that same methane is cycling through this biogenic carbon cycle. And so, as we can understand, with methane and carbon dioxide behaving very differently within our environment, their impacts on warming are very different. And so if we identify a constant emission state, we can see, again, that cycle flowing, where if methane emissions remain constant, the warming effect of methane remains constant, because the same amount of methane is being consumed as is being emitted. However, you can see with carbon dioxide, specifically in relation to fossil fuels, there's an additive component of that, because when fossil fuels are burned, there's not a mechanism for that carbon to once again re-enter below our Earth's surface. it's utilized, it's a one-way street up into the atmosphere. What makes methane of particular interest, if we direct our attention to the decreasing emission portion of the graphs, if we can decrease methane emissions, we can dramatically decrease the warming effect of methane emissions because of that same process where methane is being removed from the atmosphere. Whereas when we decrease carbon dioxide emissions, there's a plateauing effect because there's such an additive impact of carbon that's already been emitted. It's also important that we realize throughout this process that total emissions does not equal efficiency. Rather, efficiency is a ratio of inputs to outputs, and so we'd be evaluating kilograms of CO2 equivalent produced per kilogram of beef, as opposed to just saying what percent of emissions are reflected in beef production. Additionally, it's important as we evaluate and have this conversation that context matters, because we are talking about food production, and any time that we're aiming to decrease production in order to decrease emissions, there is the very real potential that food insecurity can exist and be exacerbated by our decisions. Rather, what we're looking to do on a traditional XY axis is identify supply chains that are the most productive while also having the lowest level of emissions. We run into troubles in situations where we start making trade-offs for more emissions and more productivity, as well as lower productivity for lower emissions. And of course, we always want to be moving away from supply chains that have a low level of productivity and a high level of emissions. While today we're mostly discussing greenhouse gas emissions, it is important to note that in general, these same rules are going to apply when it comes to land use efficiency, water use efficiency, and the application of herbicides and pesticides within our food production system. So with that being said, we've already identified that the future of beef production and meat consumption across the globe looks very different regionally. Do those same differences exist when it comes to carbon efficiency within our food supply? And the answer to that question is yes. On this graph here, we have emissions per kilogram of beef produced by region where that beef is produced. And we range from colors on the deep green spectrum, which are going to be approximately 10 to 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef produced, all the way to deep purple, which are over 1,500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef produced, 150 times difference in order of magnitude. And so we can see globally, our developed nations that are increasing in beef consumption the lowest are actually our most efficient producers of beef. And that generally, our developing nations, specifically in Central and South America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, are among our most inefficient. What's also interesting to note is that there are regional differences within continents and within developing nations. There are pockets of Africa that can produce beef as efficiently as regions of North America, but it is not universal. Additionally, if we switch gears and view it through the lens of milk production, we can evaluate country-specific differences of kilograms of methane produced per kilogram of milk produced. And this is just a selection of countries here. It's not all exhaustive of the global milk supply, but we can see dramatic differences from very efficient countries such as the USA, Japan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, versus countries like Cambodia, Mongolia, Zimbabwe, and Afghanistan. And it's important to note that that red line there at 0.025 kilograms of methane emitted per kilogram of milk produced, the countries that are above that line only produce 38% of the global milk supply. However, they are emitting over 67% of the methane associated with milk production. So we can see there are very real differences in the way that different regions and countries around the globe are producing livestock products. Now, correlation does not equal causation, and just where a country is located on the map does not tell the story of how more emissions are produced in different supply chains. In actuality, there's really two broad categories that can define the total difference in efficiency across different supply chains, and those are going to be management practices as well as animal genetics. So if we dive into management practices specifically, we're going to be looking at animal management and infrastructure, animal feed consumption, and lastly, manure management. To contrast two very different systems, we can see a Western modern-style barn on the left, where animals are protected from the elements. There are fans in order to facilitate cooling. There is shade and protection from inclement weather. And they're in a modified confined housing system where they're allowed to comfortably utilize a deep-bedded dry pack. Just like you or I, we're at our best when we are well-fed, well taken care of, and well-rested. And so really, if we're gonna drive productivity and efficiency in our animal systems, animals have to be healthy and they have to be comfortable in order to be efficient and productive. Contrasting that with a picture that we have here from the Saharan African food system, we can see animals that do not have those same basic requirements cared for. And so we can see that these are the specific differences from an infrastructure standpoint and what allows our United States systems and Western developed systems to be more efficient than those in other developing countries. Additionally, and perhaps most substantially, is animal feed composition. And so on the left, you'll see the gold standard in modern animal production systems, which is the total mixed ration. And you can see a very consistent, visually appealing feedstuff there, where you have a consistency in particle size, you have a number of different constituents, grains, vitamins, minerals, forage sources, as well as byproducts that can be utilized by cows in a ration that is formulated specifically to meet that cow's scientifically proven needs for growth, health, and efficiency. If we compare that to various other regions of the country, this other picture comes from India, we can see that it's a utilization of what's available to us. And so that appears to be some variation of a reed or bamboo source for those cows, and that's not gonna be as energy efficient in order to be utilized into the production of beef or milk within that animal. And lastly, we can evaluate the impacts of manure management differences. Here in California's Central Valley, we have led the global renewable energy space in the development of methane digesters, shown there on the left. This captures the methane that's emitted from the manure and other effluents that allows that gas to be utilized in clean natural gas generation or clean electricity generation. Whereas in other regions of the country, manure is quite literally dried and utilized as fuel in that it's burned in the home for cooking and heating, which not only poses a tremendous greenhouse gas emission impact, but is also detrimental to human health. If we move into genetics, we can also see that there are differences within efficient systems that go beyond just the regional differences in the carbon efficiency of our food systems. In this data here, specific to California, a 2012 study done by UC Davis traced the life cycle assessment differences in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef produced. And so even if we recall that that 21 number is extremely efficient, within the same feedlot, we can produce beef with a 50% lower carbon footprint here within California just by dictating what the breed composition of that animal is, whether it comes from a traditional beef herd or as a byproduct of our dairy industry from a Holstein mother cow herd. In order to build a more resilient and sustainable supply chain, it really boils down to our ability to enact animal traceability. And in developed nations such as our own, that means country of origin labeling that allows you, the consumers, to vote with your food dollars for the supply chains that fit your values and our global climate goals. Country of origin labeling, as we learned, is one easy way to do that, where we can reward more responsible stewards of the land and more responsible producers of our livestock products by, again, incentivizing those producers and voting with our food dollars in order to purchase food through that supply chain. Additionally, we can follow through the framework of the USDA Process Verified program, we can follow animals that meet the specific genetic and management criteria to be more efficient within our own nation through the development of novel USDA Process Verified programs. Additionally, as a global leader, we can support trade initiatives that allow us to aid in the market development and the sharing of the knowledge, skills, and infrastructure, the availability of capital that exists within our system in order to incentivize and promote more efficient production in other nations. Furthermore, alongside with the country of origin labeling, we can use the economic theory of specialization to say some countries are better able to produce milk and meat, and therefore we should decrease trade barriers that prevent them from sharing their more efficient food products across international lines. Ultimately, as we've learned today, details and differences matter within our food supply chain. Variability does exist, but variability is our opportunity for a more efficient tomorrow. Not all cattle, farms, and supply chains are created equally, but we have the opportunity today to utilize these core tenements in order to build a system that is lower from a livestock emission standpoint while increasing and meeting the demand of a hungry world. Thank you very much.